what else are you?
Does that work?
Yep.
Good. Okay. I think, yeah, it's on. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. I did, yeah. Yeah. How's my hair, Bob?
At the moment, I look a little bit more like Nanook of the North, you know. Can we begin? Great. Welcome all. My name is Elliot Cohen. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'm also a member of the Council of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which makes it a particular pleasure to be here. I think one of my fellow council members, Ellen Leipson, is indeed there. Hi, Ellen. Why don't we get right to it? It's a real pleasure to be with an old friend, H.R. McMaster, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. We go back a long way. General McMaster's career, probably known to most of you. I'll just touch on a few of the highlights. A hero of the first Gulf War, at a battle called 73 Easting, which made his mark. Also made his mark with a dissertation turned into book called Dereliction of Duty, which is one of the more important books that has come out about civil-military relations in Vietnam. Went on to other commands, including most notably serving in the Iraq War in command of an armored cavalry regiment at the Battle of Tel Afar. Continuing on to serve in Afghanistan. And now HR, I'm going to butcher your title, if so I'll let you give it to me directly.
It's Deputy Commanding General for Training and Doctrine Command for Futures, and then the clunky long title is the Army Capabilities Integration Center.
I'm glad I didn't try to memorize that.
Arctic.
But what HR is really that quite extraordinary combination of thinker and great military leader. There aren't that many in our history. There are a few, people like General Jack Galvin, General Andy Goodpaster, but it's very few. So we're really privileged, I think, to have somebody with us who has an extraordinarily distinguished record of command, including command and combat, with an equally distinguished record as a thinker. He was also, I should have mentioned up front, a senior fellow at the IISS, and remains affiliated with IISS as well. So it's wonderful to be here with him, particularly since, as I said, we're old friends. The way we thought we'd do this is begin it as a conversation. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask General McMaster, draw him out on a few subjects, and then I'll moderate a discussion from the floor. So, HR, the Army has just produced something called the Army Operating Concept, which I guess you had stewardship of. What is an operating concept, and why does the Army need it?
Right. Okay. Well, it's a great question, Elliot. What a privilege it is to be here with you and at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, an organization which I think makes tremendous contributions to international security and an institution that really benefited me tremendously in my 2 years in London, which turned out to be about 4 months because I was mainly in Iraq, but had access to the scholars at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Toby Dodge, others who really helped us tremendously in understanding how the conflict in Iraq had evolved and to help refashion the strategy there in early 2007. So what a privilege it is to be here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and with you, Elliot. The Army Operating Concept is important because it describes how Army forces will have to operate in the future. And I think one of the things that we can do, even in times of diminished resources and budget constraints, is we can think clearly, about future war, and we need to, maybe in particular, based on some of the budget constraints and so forth. So in this Army Operating Concept, we really look at the problem of future armed conflict through the lens of both continuity and change. Continuity in the nature of war, changes in the character of armed conflict. Keeping in mind, in particular, there are certain things about armed conflict that really don't change a lot, and that's really war's fundamental political nature, that war is waged to achieve sustainable political outcomes. And so in the Army Operating Concept, we talk about the Army's role in providing foundational capabilities to the joint force, but how in particular the Army has to be prepared to defeat enemy organizations, but then also to consolidate gains, to get the sustainable, usually political outcomes. We recognize in the Army Operating Concept another continuity as being in the human dimension of war. And the fact that people fight in large measure for the same reasons people fought 2,500 years ago when Thucydides identified fear, honor, and interest as what motivates people in armed conflict. And to understand that, we say in the Army Operating Concept, soldiers and leaders have to be able to develop situational understanding in close contact with enemies, but also civilian populations. What is really driving conflict? So we're not just treating the symptoms, of conflicts. We're actually dealing with the causes. The third thing we emphasize in the Army Operating Concept is that war is uncertain, that the future course of events in armed conflict has more to do than what you decide to do. It depends on really initiatives and reactions of your enemies that are often impossible to predict at the outset of a conflict. So in the Army Operating Concept, we don't say that we're going to dominate in the future. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to be able to adapt continuously to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative over capable and oftentimes elusive and determined enemies. And then finally, we recognize that war is a contest of wills. It's a contest of wills in terms of our own soldiers and teams. What John Keegan said in The Face of Battle, really, that battle, combat, is the struggle of men and women trying to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation with the achievement of some aim over which other human beings are trying to kill them. And so how do you develop in your soldiers really the ability to operate in these uncertain and complex environments, these environments of persistent danger. How do you build cohesive teams and develop resilient soldiers who can operate in these environments? So the human dimension of war is a contest of wills. These continuities are very important. But then we also looked at changes in the character of armed conflict, and through 4 lenses as well. What are threats, enemies, and adversaries? How are they evolving? We could talk more about that. What missions does the Army do as part of the joint force, as part of what we now call a clunky term, interorganizational teams, bringing in civilian capabilities, for example, and multinational teams. So anticipating those missions and how they're changing based on really geopolitics, but also based on technology, which is a third thing. What technologies can we integrate into our Army to make us more effective while keeping in mind enemy countermeasures to our technological capabilities and enemy technologies. And then finally, history and lessons learned, right? What are we learning from conflicts today, and how does that apply? So this is a description, the Army operating concept, of how Army forces have to operate in the future based on continuity and change. And then based on that description then of how our Army forces have to operate, we then determine what sort of capabilities we need in our Army. And then this is a starting point for learning, for thinking about future war, learning about future armed conflict, and then applying what we're learning to future force capability development. Not just things and material, but how we change our doctrine, how we evolve our organizations, how we change leader development and education, how we modify our training to make sure that what we say in the Army operating concept is, we want to achieve overmatch over our enemies, right? I mean, if you don't have an overmatch over an enemy in combat, that means it's a fair fight, right? And a fair fight in war is an ugly proposition. So what we want to do is achieve overmatch as part of joint forces to accomplish future missions.
That's great. Okay, so let me press you a little bit on that. We've been hearing a lot in recent months, even years, about hybrid warfare, and in particular the kinds of things the Russians have been up to in the eastern Ukraine. Does that phrase, hybrid warfare, mean anything, and is it actually new?
Right. Well, I mean, I think with both of us as historians, I think historians typically say, well, it's not really new, but I think it's reappeared, and it's reappeared with maybe a higher degree of clarity, and we can understand it better, seeing what Russia has done, for example, in Ukraine and in Crimea before that, and Georgia and so forth. And I think really to describe what hybrid means, it really means that Russia is competing on multiple battlegrounds, first of all, right? Multiple contested spaces, which war is contested not just in the physical domain, but it's contested on the battleground of information and perception. It's contested on the battleground of oftentimes political subversion, and oftentimes these conflicts bleed over into sort of organized crime networks and other transnational sort of dimensions of the conflict. So I think what's important to recognize is that to win an armed conflict, you have to be able to compete on multiple battlegrounds and contested spaces. In the Army operating concept, I think we recognize this, and what we say is that Army forces are critical to projecting not just military power, but national power to deal with these kinds of threats. And you might say, okay, what was the Army saying? What do you mean you project national power? You're just the Army. Well, really, to be able to operate effectively in contested environments and environments that are unsafe, you better take some soldiers with you, to be able to apply, political influence, develop security forces, and develop institutional capacity to provide support to governance, to rule of law, to law enforcement activities, intelligence activities, and so forth. So I think this hybrid warfare term is useful because we can see Russia using combinations of unconventional forces and conventional forces. We see that we have to be prepared for a broad range, I think, of threats on these multiple battlegrounds. I think also what Russia's actions to really, I think, in many ways, change the geopolitical landscape on the Eurasian landmass, and I think to place under duress the existing political order in Europe and try to, I think, maybe challenge it and collapse it, is what we see is the value of military forces in deterring this kind of activity, and in particular land forces, right? So I think because I'm in the Army and part of my job is to describe the Army's contribution to the joint force. I think what you see with what Russia has been able to do is wage limited war for limited objectives, to essentially in Ukraine to effect a land grab very quickly at very low cost because the Ukrainians were unable to really contest it, and then to consolidate that gain and portray the reactions of the international community as escalatory. And so, how do you cope with that kind of a capability? I think really one of the ways that you can do that is through forward deterrence. And you have to do that with land forces, right? Standoff capabilities are immensely important to our national defense. We know that. But really, it's land forces that give you the ability to ratchet up the cost at frontiers, for example, and to make it really unpalatable, right, to a power like Russia to take that kind of aggressive action with, again, unconventional forces under the cover of conventional forces. I think what we've seen with so-called hybrid warfare as well is not just the value, the deterrent value of land forces, but I think what you also see is the role of combined arms capabilities. Right? I mean, I think a lot of people sometimes question the Army. Hey, why are you developing new combat vehicles? Right? I mean, are you just trying to go back to the Cold War? Well, actually, paradoxically, those who say that are actually advocating for World War I capabilities. Really, if you want to go back to the era before combat vehicles, the Western Front is a good place to start in World War I. So, I mean, it's the combined arms capabilities, mobile protected firepower is important, right, as a tool, right, along with, special forces capabilities and conventional forces applied in combination. I think what Russia has done is showed us what combined arms is. Again, I mean, you could actually say, if you want to overstate it, that Russia is changing sort of the geostrategic landscape there with tanks, right now. So there is a value in that kind of combined arms capability. And then I think what we have said in the Army operating concept is our differential advantage in the Army and in the American Joint Force doesn't come with any one single capability, right? I mean, it comes with how we combine capabilities. Our differential advantage over the enemy is not a technology. In fact, advanced technology is probably the element of our differential advantage that is most easily transferable to our adversaries. I mean, as we know, China's been engaged in the largest theft of intellectual property in history. So what is our advantage? Our advantage is combinations of capabilities employed to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative. Combinations of technology with skilled soldiers and teams. And so I think there's a lot you can draw from the recent experience in Ukraine, and I think it highlights in large measure, the importance of land forces as part of the joint team, and the importance of combined arms and joint capabilities. What we call in the Army operating concept, joint combined arms operations.
Let me ask you be a little bit unconventional. I want to ask you just a couple of personal questions, which I think will help enrich the discussion. So, you've really had, quite extraordinarily a range of combat experiences, from being a troop commander to being on a very senior staff in Afghanistan. It is extraordinary. Could you tell me, let's say, the top 3 lessons you've taken from your personal experience fighting this country's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I think what those experiences have demonstrated to me again is really a point that I made earlier, is that there are really important continuities in the nature of war, and whenever we try to do what Karl von Clausewitz warned against, right, which he said, don't try to turn war into something that's alien to its nature, that's when we have problems. I mean, we have problems when we don't recognize the human dimension of war. War is uncertainty, and war is a contest of wills. And so I think an overall lesson, and it's a great question, because I think the lessons that we learn from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq will be as important as maybe the outcomes of those wars. I mean, I think we're at real risk of learning the wrong lessons. So I think the number one lesson is that we neglect the continuities in the nature of war in our peril. So, for example, if you think about the very successful campaign in Afghanistan in 2001, and our ability to empower Mujahideen-era militias, with our precision strike capabilities, our intelligence capabilities, with our intelligence capabilities, what we were able to do is achieve a military victory very quickly. But the military operations we conducted the way that we conducted military operations were not conducive maybe to consolidating those gains and getting to that sustainable political outcome. Those Mujahideen-era militias we empowered were able to essentially effect state capture over nascent state institutions and functions that had to be rebuilt from the ground up, because of the civil war from 92 to 96, because of, the Soviet occupation, because of the dismantlement of those institutions under the Taliban. And so those militias then morphed into organized crime networks, maybe you might call them criminalized patronage networks, who pursued criminal agendas, but also a political agenda, essentially to consolidate power in advance of a post-US Afghanistan. And so the activities that they were engaged in essentially were hollowing out the institutions we were trying to build. And the institutions critical to Afghanistan being able to cope with the regenerative capacity of the Taliban as they began to regenerate across the border in Pakistan. So I think a lesson from Afghanistan is that war is an extension of politics. You have to conduct military operations in a way that allows you to accomplish defined political objectives and to consolidate those gains. In Iraq, of course, the well-known story is not doing enough to allay the concerns of the minority population, especially the Sunni Arab population, Sunni Turkmen populations, and actually doing things that, in retrospect, exacerbated, the fears of those communities and set conditions really for the evolution of that conflict from a decentralized, localized hybrid insurgency into a large-scale communal conflict and a humanitarian disaster and so forth. So I think what the number one lesson is that neglect the continuities and the nature of war at your peril, right? And whenever a new concept comes along, like revolution, military affairs, or defense transformation that promises fast, cheap, and efficient, war in the future, we have to be very skeptical about that. The second thing, and this is a lesson I think that goes back to the Gulf War and any combat experience that that I've had, and really all my colleagues in our Army and Marine Corps in particular have had, is the human dimension of war and the psychological dimension of war, and the importance of training and leader development and the development of cohesive, confident teams, right? And so this is important because, again, to quote John Keegan, right, who found all this tremendous continuity in battle, he said that battle is aimed at the disintegration of human groups. And so how do you build soldiers and units that can operate in environments of persistent danger and deal with all of the difficulties that you have to cope with, especially seeing fellow soldiers killed, for example, and then be able to continue your mission? I think it's important for the American public to understand what it takes to build those capable, cohesive, confident teams. We undervalue that. I mean, I think one of the myths we hear in recent months and years is, hey, well, don't worry about cutting the Army because, you can just regrow it when you need it, right? And so I think what this does is it undervalues, obviously, the human dimension of war, and war on land in particular, and the importance of developing leaders over time, right? I mean, you have to develop these competencies across a career. You have to train under tough, realistic conditions. You have to build into training all those things that happen in combat, right? What happens in combat, right? You have bad information, right? You rush things in combat. You have to deal with casualties, and so building that friction, that uncertainty into your training, so that, as we say in the Army operating concept, our forces are ready to win in a complex world, right? In environments of uncertainty, in environments of complexity. And so I think that's the second big lesson is that we have to really make sure we stay focused on really the moral, ethical, and psychological preparation of soldiers and units for combat. And we have to obviously inculcate into our units our Army values, our warrior ethos. When you're in these environments of persistent danger and ambiguity, you have to make sure that you steel your soldiers against really what can be an erosion of their moral character. And so that's the second big thing I think that I've learned and I think is relevant to future armed conflict. And then the third thing I think that we've all learned is the need for us to be able to operate effectively with multiple partners, right? So that these problems that we're facing, ISIL, Daesh, these are the enemies of all civilized people, right? I mean, these are people who want to impose a medieval order. These are people who commit mass murder as their principal tactic in a war against all civilized peoples, right? And so it is the interest of civilization in these modern day frontiers between barbarism and and civilization, that we be able to work together. And I think the conference here in Washington on counter-violent extremism, that's extremely important. So I think we have to be able to develop relationships with partners, other members of the civilized world, and to do that through preparing our leaders, our Army leaders, to really to develop empathy for others, and then also to be able to engage in what we've called in the Army, we've made this a competency for our leaders, cross-cultural negotiation and mediation, right? Understanding people's interests, being able to map those interests, to see the degree to which they're congruent with each other, to recognize that winning and prevailing in these sort of contests doesn't come from just capacity building, right? It's really understanding who you're working with, what their interests are, the degree to which their interests are congruent with yours, and then to be able to exert influence as well, to either alter behavior or to help convince people that it's in their interest to take actions that are compatible with yours. I mean, we've made mistakes, I think, in sort of assuming that we're dealing with neutral state institutions and leaders, for example, when we have, for example, developed a capacity within the Ministry of Interior in Iraq, right? During a period of time when that ministry was captured by Shia Islamist militias, and I think you could say Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC really were in charge, and this ministry and its forces had become party to a sectarian civil war, and it helped create a humanitarian crisis of colossal scale. And so, but not putting the politics and that human understanding at the center, I think we inadvertently maybe have exacerbated that situation. I'm talking about through 2006, for example. So I think we've learned that we have to operate with multiple partners, but we have to do it with our eyes open. We have to recognize, put interests and politics at the center of those engagements. And so I think those are three big lessons.
Okay, last question before we throw it open. Again, a little bit unorthodox. Could you tell us the three figures who have most influenced your understanding of war and, to some extent, the nature of military leadership?
Right. Gosh, well, there's so many. I mean, there's so many great historians. There's so many great, leaders. I would say that from combat leadership, in terms of leading soldiers to close with and destroy an enemy in close combat, General Ernest Harmon is one of my heroes, who commanded the 2nd Armored Division in World War II.
Tell us a little bit more about him.
Ernest Harmon, he was a cavalryman, maybe unsurprisingly based on my background. But what I admire about him is that he made the transition, from horse cavalry and the pre-automotive revolution, in a very facile way, because he was imaginative. He understood continuities and changes in the continuities in the nature of war, changes in the character of conflict. And he was an extremely effective combat commander because he was very much attuned to the human dimension of war. So in fact, he said the most important thing in combat is leadership. He said the most important thing you can do as a leader is put leaders in positions of leadership. And he wrote a great document, and I think it ought to be more widely available. I know you can probably get it on the internet. I've got a copy if anybody's interested. It's Notes on Combat Actions in Tunisia and North Africa. And so another great thing about Harmon is he learned and learned from combat in North Africa. And he wrote this paper and sent it out to his colleagues in the other infantry divisions and armored divisions so that they could benefit from what he learned in North Africa prior to the D-Day invasions. And if you go through that document, I used that document to prepare our cavalry troop for operations in Desert Storm. And so, some fundamental things, right? He said, Army units are kind of like a good football team, or you could say rugby team even, since we're at ISS. And he said, a good team knows about 8 plays, and they use these plays in combination, So battle drills, right? Rehearsed responses to a predictable set of circumstances in combat is what battle drills are, right? And so these are fundamental things, right? Fire and maneuver. He said that, combat in the desert is sort of like naval tactics. These are things that informed our preparation in 1991, written, in 1942, 1943. So Ernest Harmon is, I think, one of those guys. Which I'm trying to pick people that maybe not be as obvious. I think in terms of political military, leadership, obviously George Marshall, right? And I think that that he set the example in terms of civil-military relations and civil control of the military. Elliot, you as a scholar of civil-military relations know this much better than I do. But I think he set a tremendous example for military officers to understand what your duty is and then also what your duty is not, right? It's your job to give your best military advice, but it's not your job to advocate for policy, right? Because nobody elects generals to make policy. And this is a key lesson to not cross that line between advice and advocacy. It's a blurry line. It's hard to distinguish. But I think in terms of professional responsibility and adhering to civil control of the military, George Marshall. How about intrepidity, imaginative leadership, bold action? You know, I think it's just President's Day weekend. George Washington, right? I mean, George Washington, I think, is underappreciated as a leader, and I think if you just read David Hackett Fisher's, book, you get an appreciation for, how he saw possibilities and opportunities, which I think is a very important quality for a military leader when others only saw difficulties, right? And I think that's because he had also been a student of war and warfare. He had sort of obviously had an experience during the French and Indian Wars, but he really developed his ability to lead by reading and thinking. So I think across all three of these leaders is a commitment to learning the profession and studying war, as Sir Michael Howard has said to study it, right, in width, depth, and context. And so one of the things that we're emphasizing in our Army, obviously, is inculcating in our leaders a desire for lifelong learning and for reading and thinking about it. Think about how arrogant it would be if you don't do that, right? You're basically, essentially, you're saying, all I need is my personal experience, and I'll be able to figure out any wartime situation, right? I mean, no, of course not. You have to read and think and learn continuously to be a true professional in our military and in our Army.
Wonderful answer. Okay, why don't we move to questions? I think people would ask you to be concise. If you could identify yourself and an institutional affiliation, and I believe we'll be passing microphones around. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub. I'm retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. Sir, you mentioned not only achieving a military win over the enemy, but also consolidating gains. Along the lines of consolidation, I wonder if you could discuss the issue, which I believe is somewhat controversial, about disbanding the Iraqi army and the debathification under Ambassador Bremer. That's been written about a lot. I'm sure you've heard about it much more than I have. I wonder if you could make a comment on that action.
Well, I think these are mistakes that are very clear in retrospect, I think, and I would call them mistakes, There were no easy solutions in Iraq. I mean, obviously, if you were to recall maybe too much of the army, for example, you could have exacerbated the fears of certain elements of the Shia community, and especially the expatriates who were coming back into the country after the collapse of the regime, and maybe that could have led, obviously, to other problems and so forth. So there were no easy solutions, but I do think that if you look at sort of policy decisions in the immediate sort of military victory over the Hussein regime or collapse of that regime, that in retrospect it seems as if we were trying to make it as hard on ourselves as we could, right? And that's involving the decision not to recall portions of the army, of course, and not recognizing that the 60% of the army was Shia to begin with, that this was a symbol of national identity. To recognize, again, what Thucydides said, war is waged for fear, honor, and interest. I would say fear, sense of honor, and so not recalling portions of the army was a violation of sort of the sense of honor of Iraqi and Arab nationalists to a certain extent. And then I think then helped this localized, decentralized hybrid insurgency coalesce over time. Other decisions involving severe debathification, not just within the army but outside the army, into education and so forth, exacerbated that problem, as did, I think, other decisions such as the makeup of the interim governing council and so forth. So I think whenever we don't put politics at the center of a conflict and then understand what is the political objective that we want to achieve and then develop a political strategy to get there, then subordinate everything to that political strategy. I think essentially that was what we were able to achieve in the rewrite of the Iraqi campaign plan to catch up to the evolution of this conflict in early 2007. And we were able to do it because we had, David Pierce, I'm sure a colleague of yours, who's now our ambassador to Greece. I mean, he had done the Iraq Study Group project, which was, as we know, largely it wasn't given the attention maybe it should have been given, we should say, right? In 2003, and then he and Ambassador Robert Ford and Toby Dodge of ISS, wrote the political strategy, and then wrote a diplomatic strategy to deal with, because these conflicts are, they're internal political dynamics and they're external political dynamics, and you have to address both, right? To begin to move them toward the sustainable outcome consistent with your vital interests. And so the key is asking the right questions up front, right? What is the nature of the conflict? What are our vital interests that are at stake? What are our political objectives? What is the political strategy, which by 2007 became then to move Iraq's communities toward a political accommodation, right? To do that by establishing some mediating mechanisms that will allow us to influence that from the bottom up and from the top down. And then to develop indigenous mediating mechanisms over time to get to that political accommodation between Iraq's communities that would remove support for both the Shia Islamist militias and for al-Qaeda in Iraq and its associates. Then everything was subordinated to that. The military strategy was then to go after the so-called irreconcilables, right? And then those, if you take negotiation and mediation, theory, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, was, we're going to kick your ass militarily. So it would help move, communities toward that political accommodation. And then, of course, the other element of the military strategy was to get people to stop shooting each other, because it's tough to come to an accommodation when you're shooting at each other. So it was to break the cycle of violence, to work on local ceasefires. And so then it also drove our security force assistance efforts, how we're going to do development, our information and communications efforts were all subordinated to a political strategy. So I think that was one of the key lessons, to get back to Elliot's question earlier. And I would say that we did make mistakes early in the Iraq War that in many ways made it as hard on us as we could make it.
Gentleman over there. I think you're about to get the microphone.
Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Could you talk a little more about how the Army is preparing its soldiers in the transition from combat operations to the peacetime Army, if there is such a thing, so that they don't lose their morale, they maintain their proficiency, and and also how we're helping our allies think about that in their own forces.
Right. Well, great points. And of course, we weren't anticipating, obviously, a post-war period, right? Even just a year ago, and just a little bit over a year ago. And I think if you look at what has occurred, since that time, we mentioned, Russia and its actions earlier. I think that we see that I think everybody recognizes, right, that it's narcissistic to think that if you leave a war, it stops, right? That in fact, wars continue even after you leave. If you leave a movie in the middle and the movie's still playing, So I think we've seen that dynamic in Iraq, and we're anticipating, a continued contested environment in Afghanistan. Although I think there've been some very promising developments there regionally, and with the change in national leadership there. So I think that. What I think our Army recognizes, and I think it's important to recognize this maybe outside the Army, is that demands on land forces in a post-war period tend to go up historically. And so we are in a period now where we see our Army getting smaller, I think dramatically smaller, but the demand for land forces is going up. And so we have about 150,000 soldiers deployed overseas now in a broad range of roles. In Iraq, as we know, in Afghanistan, but also, forward deployed we've been successful as a joint force in preventing great power conflict for over 70 years. That's been due in large measure to our forces that are positioned overseas. And so we're engaged in a broad range of activities with special operations forces and conventional forces in 120 countries right now for our Army. And so I think this anticipation of a period of peace and lack of engagement by land forces, it may be premature to say the least. So in terms of keeping our leaders challenged and engaged in that, I think I think we see a number of challenges with which our soldiers and leaders are engaged across the globe. The other thing I would tell you, though, is that we are endeavoring to institutionalize the lessons of the last 13 years of war, and I think our Army's done a pretty good job of this in terms of our doctrine, in terms of what we've learned about combat leadership, our philosophy of mission command, right, which is decentralized operations based on mission orders, and we recognize that to deal with complexity, these kind of complex environments, we have to trust. We need trust, up and down our chain of command, so if anybody's looking for a challenge, if anybody is looking to be able to serve something bigger than yourselves, I mean, sign up for the U.S. Army, and I think what you see is soldiers and leaders who are continuing to extend their service because they are aware of not just the demands on them that service places, but on the less tangible rewards of service. And what are those? Well, I think that these are underappreciated by our society sometimes, and this is something we have to communicate more effectively. I think they come with being part of something bigger than yourself, right? To feel that you can make a contribution to efforts that are important to, I think, the future and security of all humanity, and I think we can see that dramatically, today across the greater Middle East, for example. And I think you also are then part of a team. You're part of a team where the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives, for you. Where else is that replicated, really? So I think there are tremendous rewards of service that obviously you don't really become aware of until you're part of that kind of military organization that really takes on the qualities of a family. So I think as leaders, we have to maintain those bonds of trust with our subordinate leaders and our units. We have to challenge them, right? I mean, there's no shortage of challenges right now, right? I mean, soldiers join the Army because they expect it to be hard, right? I mean, they're disappointed when it's not, right? So, I think our Army does a great job of challenging and bringing out the best in young men and women, and so I think that the reports of a period of peace during which people are going to become bored, disinterested, going back to sort of peacetime like rock painting or whatever it is. I mean, it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen, and I can't see it happening in the foreseeable future anyway.
How about all the way in the back?
Bud McFarland, General, thanks very much for your service in all of our conflicts in the past 40 years, and for your vision and originality of thought. I wonder if I could ask you to comment on stability in Asia and how to preserve it, deterrence, resolution of disputes peacefully, and how you see the role of the Army in that.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question, sir. As you know that we have 55,000 soldiers committed to the Pacific Theater, which is the largest of any theaters, including bigger than Central Command. So there's this idea that now with the shift in emphasis to the Pacific, that suddenly the Army's interested. Well, the Army's always been in the Pacific, as we know, at least since the pre-World War I period, post Philippines War. I mean, we've been involved in the Pacific, and I think will continue to play a vitally important role. So, what does the Army do in the theater security sort of architecture of the Pacific, and maintaining really the security order that has led really to the global economy that we've all benefited from, and the security from which all countries in Asia and globally have benefited from free trade and so forth, and stability in Asia. Well, I think it's going to really be analogous to what we've done in the past. The Army provides foundational capabilities. So in the Army operating concept, we say we're the foundation of the joint force, and what that means is that the Army provides multiple options to the President and the Secretary of Defense across all theaters. And what does that mean? And well, that means theater logistics capabilities, ballistic missile defense, intelligence capabilities, communications capabilities. But also what we provide is really a tangible and credible commitment of the United States of America, sort of better than anybody, the role of land forces in establishing and maintaining security. I mentioned the key role in Northeast Asia for Army forces, But I think what you see is that applies broadly across the region. And in particular, I think that working through partners, and in Asia, of course, the dominant military service in our partner countries is the Army. And so I think that is a vitally important role, is Army forces conducting what we call regional engagement and regionally aligned forces to develop the capabilities of our partners, to work on interoperability, and then obviously to send a very clear message to any powers in Asia who would want to try to establish some kind of a hegemonic order that would restrict freedom of trade and commerce or coerce our partners in the region, that it's not worth it, right? I mean, that there's an alternative path, which is a path of not confrontation and continuing to benefit from the economic order of which American security for which American security has provided a foundation. We also think in terms of military capabilities for a theater like the Pacific, where you really rely on freedom of movement and action in the air, space, maritime, and increasingly cyberspace domains, that Army forces play an important role for the fundamental reason that people live on land, obviously, and that any problems that manifest themselves in the maritime, air, space, or cyberspace domains originate on land to begin with. As technology is transferred to other countries or other countries who steal that technological capabilities, who can then challenge what has been now, sort of multi-decade dominance in those fluid domains, I think it's going to be increasingly important for Army forces to have the capability to conduct what we call expeditionary maneuver. Expeditionary maneuver is the deployment of forces into unexpected locations with the appropriate combinations of mobility, protection, and lethality to defeat an enemy organization and establish control of territory, to deny its use to the enemy, to secure populations and to consolidate gains, but increasingly we think to project power outward from land into the maritime, air, space, and cyber domains to ensure freedom of movement and action of our joint forces, and to restrict use of those domains by our enemies. And there's been a lot written about this, obviously, and the Office of Net Assessment and other think tanks in the region in D.C. have worked on this, so-called anti-access air denial capabilities, how we develop an answer to that. I think the Army plays a very important role as part of the joint force in that. So from a military operations perspective, I think that the term I would use is expeditionary maneuver, and I think maneuver is important. I think when we look at theaters, oftentimes we tend to look at potential military operations as a big targeting exercise, and we reduce war to a bunch of targets that we then engage with standoff capabilities. And then what we fail to recognize is really what is important in coercing an enemy or deterring an enemy. Thomas Schelling obviously identified this, decades ago, is that you need to have available, a brute force option, which is really an option to compel an outcome. Standoff capabilities without land power capabilities leave decisions in the hands of your adversary. Land force capabilities play a complementary role to the joint force standoff capabilities because you demonstrate commitment and you're also able to do positive things on land, whereas standoff capabilities tend to be punitive in nature. And those positive things can be bolstering the capabilities of allies, as I mentioned, developing their capability and so forth. So I see the Army as today having a very important role in Asia in terms of theater security architecture. And again, as I mentioned, it's the largest commitment of soldiers abroad of any theater. And I see it maybe growing in importance depending on the behavior of other powers in the region and the threats that they pose to international security and to our partners and allies.
Yes, gentleman over there.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a fantastic brief. It's always just fascinating to hear you speak, and very humbling to hear of your perspectives and experience. My name is David Ucko. I'm an associate professor at CISA at the National Defense University. My question relates really to this issue that you mentioned previously, institutionalization of capabilities. It strikes me that the Army has learned very many hard-won lessons in the last 10, 15 years of operations, and in so doing have had to rely on various ad hoc mechanisms to fill enduring capability gaps. We can think, for example, of the human terrain teams or
Yes.
even the provisional reconstruction teams,
Right.
and also perhaps the capabilities required to advise and assist and really mentor security forces in host nations. I was just wondering, we're not going back from an era of warfare, as you rightly pointed out, but in the aftermath of what we call the Iraq and Afghan operations, what efforts have been made to institutionalize some of the capabilities needed within the Army? How do you see those efforts progressing at the same time as the Army is being shrunk, as you rightly note?
Right.
I'm going to ask you to give a fairly brief answer because we're running up on 11:30. Is that a hard stop? So, okay, well, it's a somewhat flexible stop. In that case, I'm going to throw one more question at you after you answer
Great.
this one.
All right, David, thanks. I mean, I think it's a great question. So Army's done, I think, quite a bit. So as you know, adaptation in conflict will always outpace the institution's ability to sort of absorb and make permanent some of those adaptations. And so the institutional Army is caught up, is catching up, you know, to I think a lot of those hard-won lessons. So, but our doctrine has changed, as everybody knows, you know, the counterinsurgency manual, but it's the implications of that across all of our manuals. So, for example, in the Army, our brigade manual, which is an important manual for us to understand how we fight together as teams, has new chapters, right? The first is on understanding the environment, right? And it's understanding the conflict and understanding the local dynamics within a particular area. We used to think, you know, if you go back to the old days, right, see yourself, the enemy in context of the terrain. I've got it. No, it's also in context of the human dynamics and the political dynamics and the cultural and ideological and religious and so forth and tribal dynamics. And so we've institutionalized that in our doctrine. We've also institutionalized it in our training and the tasks and competencies that we develop in our leaders. So our Army has come up with an Army leader development strategy that emphasizes language and religion and culture and that kind of understanding from the very beginning, you know, from pre-commissioning all the way through you know, through colonel, you know, once you become part of the problem, you know, and you're hardwired, you know. So we get that going early in leaders' careers and for our non-commissioned officers as well. And so leader development is a huge aspect of all of this. A lot of those adaptations also include resiliency training. And also advanced situational awareness training for advanced cognition and to be able to identify the presence of the extraordinary, absence of the ordinary, advanced situational awareness training. That's all institutionalized now in programs of instruction. So the first manifestation of all this is these were sort of add-ons. Now they're integrated into all of our training, into our scenarios and our educational opportunities. Our training environments, we have an organization called the Training Brain Operations Center. How cool is that, right? The TBOC. And that basically what this organization does at TRADOC is it takes big data from conflicts and it's classified data and genericizes it and makes it unclassified, applies it to different terrain, to different simulations, and now we have that rich texture of a complex environment and all that data that feeds into our exercises as well. You see this in our combat training centers. You know, we're not going to go back on this. You know, some people say, well, we need to go back to the basics. You know, so we need to go back to fighting wars as we would like to fight them, rather than as they are. No, we're not going to do that. And so I think we've made great strides in ensuring that we institutionalize a lot of our lessons in leader competencies and leader development, in training, in doctrine, in organization as well. I think with the changes to our brigade and other organizations. So it's a work in progress. I think we're getting better all the time. The one thing I would highlight in the Army operating concept, again, I ask you to read it. They're just one of the many perks of coming to ISS. There's some free copies in the back. But in here we've also established a framework for learning. Now the Army learns enthusiastically, right? But oftentimes not with a lot of finesse, okay? And ability maybe to organize what we've learned, right? So we have all these lessons, right? Well, how do we combine these lessons into a body of knowledge that we can use to then improve our capabilities? So what we've said is, we know we're going to be wrong about future war, right? Sir Michael Howard has said, right, no matter how hard you try, you're going to be off the mark. The key is to not be so far off the mark that you can't adjust once the real demands of conflict are revealed to you. So what's the best way to make sure you're not too far off the mark? Ask the right questions. So in the Army Operating Concept in Annex B, we've asked 20 first-order questions, the answers to which will improve current and future force combat effectiveness. The first of those is one you alluded to in your question, which is how to develop and sustain a high degree of situational understanding against adaptive enemies in complex environments. Now, we're never going to solve that, But if we work together across our Army, with academia, with our multinational partners, with our civilian partners in state and aid, I mean, then we can really advance our capability in that area. So that's what we've done to institutionalize. We have a framework for learning. We have venues for learning, which we're calling Force 2025 maneuvers. And that's all of our experimentation, our wargaming, but it's also practical experience. It's exercises, multinational exercises, interoperability work that we're doing. And so now we have a place to put all of this, right? And then to work together across the relevant communities to develop what we call DOT. We have doctrine, organization, training, leader development, material, personnel, facilities, integrated solutions, interim solutions to those problems. And so I'm really excited about it. This is something that Joe Odierno, our Chief of Staff, has driven. And so when you talk about innovation, right? Innovation is the buzzword these days. It ought to be, right? You want to innovate. And what we have said is innovation, it's a tenet in our Army operating concept. Innovation is turning ideas or experiences you're alluding to into valued outcomes, right? It's not just having an idea, it's turning it into a valued outcome. And so there's a qualitative aspect to it, but there's also a temporal dimension. We say in the Army, we have to innovate fast enough to stay ahead of determined and adaptive enemies. So we're endeavoring to try to adapt faster and to innovate better with a higher degree of clarity. And I'm excited about being part of that effort in our Army.
Let me ask you the last question. Understanding that politics is uncertain and warfare even more so, still, if you had to guess, what is the way or the ways in which you think the next war will actually be very different from Iraq and Afghanistan?
Okay, well, all right, here's some of the things that I'm concerned about in terms of keeping pace with changes in the character of warfare, I would say. So what would be different? I think what we are seeing is we're seeing our enemies emulate what we have seen as our differential advantages. So our enemies will really do four things, I think, right? Four things that we have to consider that are changes in the character of warfare. The first thing they're going to do is, I mentioned, avoid our capabilities, right? I mean, so on land, you know, you have tens of thousands of so-called targets. They're not targets on land. I mean, they're people. And all of them are trying to avoid being classified as such, right? So we have to consider the countermeasures that we've seen adopted now, and I think we've seen harbingers of future conflict in what we see today. And that's dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian populations, and deception. So they're going to evade our capabilities. They're going to disrupt our capabilities. We have to be prepared for this. So, you know, our network strike capabilities, our communications capabilities, our dependence on certain sort of technological advantages, I think are going to be at risk. And so what does that mean for us? I mean, it means we have to develop systems that degrade gracefully. We have to be able to operate degraded and in much more contested environments. We think that our ability to dominate in the airspace, you know, maritime, cyberspace domains is going to be in question, right? So we're not, as I mentioned, operate on land in ways that, you know, facilitate freedom of action and movement in those more contested domains. So enemies going to disrupt what has been our advantages. We think also that our enemies are going to emulate our capabilities, and this is one of the things I'm concerned about, right? Access to commercial satellite imagery, unmanned aerial systems, right, and swarm capabilities associated with autonomous and semi-autonomous systems, long-range missile capabilities tied to weapons of mass destruction, which some have called A2AD, but I think that's actually a narcissistic way to define it, only in relation to us and what we want to do. I think this is a tremendous offensive capability by potential enemies that is analogous to the V1 and V2 threat to London in World War II. It's analogous to the Scud missile threat out of the Western Desert in 1991 to Israel. It's analogous to the rocket threat out of southern Lebanon to Israel, or the rocket threat out of Gaza. And I think what we're going to see increasingly are enemies using these long-range missile capabilities in urban areas and in restrictive terrain, which is going to demand a joint force answer to this, right? What was the answer to the V1, V2 threat? What was the answer to the Scud missile? It wasn't just standoff capabilities. Our Army's got to be prepared to contribute to that through, as I mentioned, expeditionary maneuver capabilities. And then I think our enemies are going to expand onto other battlegrounds as they have already. And this is the battleground of political subversion, the connection of our enemies to transnational organized crime networks. And so what's different, and we see harbingers of this already, is we need better integration of civilian interorganizational capabilities, right? Threat finance is going to be more important than ever. I think the ability to integrate law enforcement with military operations, we need to ramp that up, right? Along the lines of what Treasury does, but Treasury's limited in their capacity. I think they're an example, though, of what we can do from an interdepartmental perspective. And I think what we have to do is we have to be able to get better at defeating enemy organizations through the broad range of capabilities that come with all of the elements of national power and organized to do that. And so we have to look at these organizations and analyze them based on who they are, what they're trying to achieve, what is their strategy to achieve it. Then we have to map these networks, right, in terms of nodes in the networks and their roles. But we have to see flows through these networks internationally of people, money, weapons, often narcotics and other commodities. And then we have to be able to understand relationships between these enemy networks and licit networks in state institutions, in businesses, who are beneficial owners of companies that are aiding and abetting some of these groups that are destabilizing regions and victimizing innocent people. And then we have to be able to exert influence in a concerted manner, applying, again, all the elements of national power. Military force, certainly, right? I mean, if we have a name and address and they're a threat to our vital interests, we can deal with that. But how about other authorities we can bring to bear? Law enforcement authorities, extraterritorial jurisdiction, and authorities that we can be brought to bear, travel bans, visa denials, targeted economic sanctions. And so, I recommend highly Juan Zarati's book, Treasury's War. I think is extremely good in this. Shima Keen has done some great work on this. I think that, Transparency International does great work on it. So I think that we have to, then how do we go after these networks? The ultimate questions we ought to ask is, what are the sources of strength for these networks and what are their vulnerabilities? And so these groups that are so-called, supposed to be religious groups, right? I think that they are criminal, not only because they commit mass murder of innocent people, but because they rely on criminality, for their sources of strength and for their funding and their ability to mobilize resources. So I see greater threats. I see greater threats to international security that emerge from these sort of hybrid organizations. And I see great demands on our forces because what we have seen in the past is our asymmetrical advantages may not be our advantages. And so we have to work even more effectively as a joint team to counter enemies who evade our capabilities, who disrupt our capabilities, who expand onto these other battlegrounds and emulate, our capabilities.
HR, you've described a pretty daunting world. I'll just say, speaking for myself, but I think for a lot of other people as well, I'm glad you're one of the people who's going to be leading the Army through it. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Larry.
That's great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.